Vintage. What is it? How do you transform it into a cube? All that and more, you're listening to the CardMisers podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of CardMisers. I'm your host, Jake Kitterman.
Yellow, it's Travis Marshall.
And today we're going to be talking about Vintage, its power level, and how the format translates into a cube.
It's a lot to get to today, so let's start cracking. Alright, so Vintage, the format. Now, Vintage is a format of Magic, much like Standard, Modern, Legacy, Pioneer, etc., where you have a certain pool of cards that you can play from, and, you build competitive 60-card decks. There's a lot of tournaments, very prevalent on Magic the Gathering Online, where more of the expensive cards are much cheaper. We'll get to that sort of thing later. So, staple cards of the format, Jake. I think we should talk about that. Talk about the cards that make Vintage vintage. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. And every format has its staple cards, and that's what makes that format just like Standard.
Right, yeah. And like with the way Oko in Once Upon a Time were the staple cards.
Yeah,
and,
yep.
And the way, fetch lands are the staple cards of Modern. So,
exactly.
Jake, you want to talk about what the staple cards are known as in Vintage?
Yeah, so Vintage has all of the cards Magic has printed throughout its whole history, so that will make Vintage an extremely powerful format. And so there are such powerful cards that Magic has printed in its time, we refer to them as the Power 9, Travis.
Right, yeah. So as Jake was saying, Vintage is a format where all cards Magic has ever printed, with few exceptions, are legal. Now, the creme of the creme, the top cards in this extremely vast format are called the Power 9, as Jake said. So these cards are the most powerful cards that have ever been printed in Magic's history. They are extremely rare. They are also extremely old, and they are from a time when Magic wasn't quite sure how to balance cards properly.
Yep, and they are not good for your bank account. They are extremely expensive cards.
Amen. Jake, you want to start off?
Yeah, I'll start off this list, and first of all, we'll have 5 Moxen, and these are 0-mana artifacts that can tap for one of the 5 colors in Magic, and they are some of the most powerful cards Magic has ever printed because you can play them for free, and they get you ahead of the mana that you should have in that turn. So, for example, if you're on turn 1, you should theoretically have 1 mana, but with the Moxen, if you had 1 or even 2 in hand, you could be playing on turn 3 on turn 1 because you have 3 mana instead of 1.
Right. So these Moxen are called Mox Jet, Mox Pearl, Mox Ruby, Mox Sapphire, and Mox Emerald, and they are 5 of the most powerful artifacts ever printed.
That is correct. And now that we have the Moxen out of the way, we can head to those wretched blue cards such as Time Twister, Travis.
Right, so Time Twister, this card is kind of a pet favorite of mine. I've never actually owned a copy, but I absolutely love it. This card is what's commonly known as a wheel effect, where you get to shuffle your hand and your graveyard into your library and draw a new 7 cards. This is really powerful. There are many effects like it in Magic, like Wheel of Fortune. Now, this effect is really powerful because it will allow you to draw a whole new hand of cards. This sort of effect is especially powerful in a deck like Storm or a combo deck that's trying to find specific pieces.
Yep, so if you just have 1 card left in your hand and it's Time Twister, boom, you have 7 more.
Exactly. It's like a draw 7 for 3 mana. Super powerful. Moving on to the next one, we have one of Jake's favorite expressions, Time Walk. Now, this is a 2-mana sorcery that is 1 and a blue and will allow you to take an extra turn after this one. Super busted card.
So my favorite example of this is whenever someone makes a huge tempo play, I'm just like, hey, you just got time walked, or hey, I just time walked you, or something like that. So it's definitely my favorite of the Power 9.
Yep, Jake really. I think you really overuse that expression. I hate it when you blow up my expensive spells and then you're like, oh, time walked you. Really, really quite annoying.
It's well deserved.
All right, moving on. We've got the Black Lotus. Now, this card, honestly, we should have saved it for last because this card is the poster child for Magic the Gathering. When people think of Magic the Gathering, they think of Black Lotus. This is arguably the most powerful card ever printed in all of Magic. It's a 0-mana artifact that has tap and sacrifice Black Lotus and add 3 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool. Obviously, you can see how this is disgusting. Okay, on turn 1, you can have 4 mana if you have a land and then this Black Lotus. That is unheard of in any other kind of card. It's ridiculous. And of course, it just takes the Black Lotus. The Black Lotus does it all by itself. So for that reason, Black Lotus is insanely busted, And also, you see how powerful it is reflected in its cost, Jake, how expensive is a Black Lotus?
Yeah, a Black Lotus is $5,000 to $10,000. I gotta say, I can't afford one of those. But a Black Lotus is kind of like having 3 Moxen in a way. It's almost like 3 of the Power 9 just for 1 card.
Exactly, yeah. So moving on to the final card, you'll notice that of this Power 9, 3 of the cards are blue, which just goes to show that Magic just loves blue because they make it so busted. So anyways, this final card is Ancestral Recall, the most powerful card draw spell ever printed. It's for 1 blue, instant, draw 3 cards. That's all I got to say about it, Jake.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a whole bunch, but when you can pay 1 mana at any time during the game almost and draw 3 cards, you can just get so much gas from doing that, and for such a low and efficient cost, it can really put you over the top in a lot of games.
Right, yeah, and as Jake said, efficiency is the name of the game. There are many cards in Magic that allow you to draw 3 cards just for that 1 card, but they all cost upwards of 4 mana. Being able to pay 1 mana for 3 cards is just absolutely ridiculous. It's ridiculous to pay 1 mana for 1 card, and that's why Ancestral Recall is just off the hook.
Absolutely. So now that you guys know about the Power 9 and at the power level of Vintage as a format, and that it has all the cards that Magic has ever printed, we can go over some of the decks in the format, Travis.
Right, so we're just going to give you a quick, obviously we can't, list the Vintage meta at this time because it could change, in a year, in a few months, depending on whether or not a new Oko is printed. That's a pop reference joke, guys. Anyways, Magic pop culture, rather. Anyways, so some really powerful archetypes that are seen in the Vintage format are things like Storm. This is one of my favorite things to play because I find it really fun to cast a lot of spells in a turn and then kill your opponent. So the point of Storm, the mechanic Storm, is a mechanic that allows you to copy a spell that has Storm for each spell that you've cast that turn prior, or each spell that has been cast. It even counts your opponent's spells. So what you're trying to do in this deck is just cast a lot of spells, and then cast your Storm finisher that will kill your opponent. So the most famous Storm finisher is a card called Tendrils of Agony. For its 2 and then 2 black mana for a sorcery that has your opponent lose 2 life and you gain 2 life. So if you cast 9 other spells that turn, you'll cast it, you get 10 copies, you drain your opponent for 20, and you gain 20. That's it, game over. So this archetype is really powerful in Vintage because with all of the really low, inefficient costed spells, like the Moxen or Black Lotus that cost literally nothing, or even Ancestral Recall, which can draw you tons of cards for only 1 mana, or Time Twister that can refill your entire hand for only 3 mana, it allows you to cast a lot of spells really quickly and all in 1 turn and storm with the opponent, which makes it super powerful, specifically in the Vintage format where they have really fast mana and mana rocks for free.
Yep, and Storm is my least favorite, so I'm going to move on to Reanimator, where in Reanimator, you're trying to dump really big and giant creatures into your graveyard to later reanimate them in the game or even right away. So some examples of this are with the Eldrazi, and this is kind of a funky combo because when the Eldrazi hit the graveyard, they actually have a trigger to take your graveyard and shuffle it into your deck along with that Eldrazi. So while that trigger is on the stack, these decks have a card called Goryo's Vengeance, which is an instant, so while that triggers on the stack, you can cast Goryo's Vengeance, which allows you to reanimate a legendary creature spell from your graveyard and put it on the battlefield. And so this card works really well with the Eldrazi's because they're just big, giant creatures, and they shouldn't be in your graveyard, which is why they have the triggered ability to shuffle them into your deck.
Right, and so with Reanimator, the namesake of the entire deck is a card called Reanimate, which is 1 black mana for a sorcery, and it says return target creature card from a graveyard to the battlefield under your control. You lose life equal to that creature's converted mana cost. Now this card is the most efficient reanimate spell, or spell that puts a creature from a graveyard onto the battlefield ever printed in the history of Magic, and so it is a sort of staple card in the Reanimator decks in Vintage, because it's just the most powerful version. And so to be able to put a Gristlebrand from your graveyard onto the battlefield, or a Worldspire Worm, or any number of ridiculously busted and huge cards, huge and powerful creature cards, on even turn 1, or at least way earlier than you have any right putting them there, is what makes this deck Vintage playable.
For sure. And so that will bring us to stacks.
Oh, can I take this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So stacks, The next two are pretty similar in the archetypes that we're about to mention, but Stacks is an artifact-centric deck built around the principle of straining your opponent's resources and slowing down their game plan in a way that will eventually sort of prevent them from ever, trying to do what their deck's trying to do. And so cards that sort of facilitate this are cards like Smokestack, which makes their opponent sacrifice, or makes every player sacrifice permanents, and things like Tangle Wire, which taps down your opponent's permanents, as well as, certain artifacts that make spells cost more to cast. And so this strategy is basically trying to prevent your opponent from getting their game plan online and to strip them of their resources as fast as possible. And so that's what makes this deck super competitive, is that it can just pull any deck to a grinding halt regardless of its speed. So this will bring us to the next deck, which is sort of similar. Jake, take it away with Prison.
Yeah, so Prison is my favorite to play over Stacks because they're pretty similar, but I do like playing white, and that's what Prison is all about. So they mainly focus on the color white, and instead of artifacts, they use enchantments. So cards like Sphere of Safety, cards like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, that makes their non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. So what these cards are trying to do, they're trying to imprison your opponent, hence the name Prison. They're trying to put taxes on your opponent's cards so they can't play them the time their deck is supposed to play them. And that will really change the way they have to go about playing their deck and playing that game. So it will impact the tempo of their plays, and that can really mess up what their deck is trying to do, especially on certain turns. And so with Prison, they even try and go after your lands. So for example, cards like Leonin Arbiter and Strip Mine and Wasteland. So Leonin Arbiter can prevent your opponent from fetching, which is a huge thing in Vintage. And if they can't get their mana, then they just can't play their spells. And same thing with Wasteland and Strip Mine. They are lands themselves, but they can tap and you can sacrifice them to destroy target opponent's land. And you can really mess up their mojo with that.
Exactly, yeah. So in that way, in this sort of way you're trying to control your opponent rather than, play your own linear strategy is what makes Stacks in Prison really common. It's really the color difference and the use of white cards over artifacts. Also, another thing, Jake, that Prison has is that it has access to some of the best removal ever printed, Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile,
Yep.
Just the best removal spells ever made. Right, so moving on to the final one, this is absolutely my absolute favorite archetype.
Yeah.
I know I said I liked Storm back there, but really this is my cup of tea right here, Dredge. So in Vintage, there's a lot of Manolos Dredge, which is a deck that doesn't use any mana whatsoever and tries to turn over from the library as many cards into the graveyard as quickly as possible, and they have other cards that will then take advantage of that lightning quick milling in order to leverage out a win. So there are a lot of creatures that have been printed over Magic's history that can return from the graveyard to the battlefield if they were put there from the library or if another creature entered the battlefield from the graveyard. So specifically cards like Narcomoeba, which does, as I said, enter the battlefield if it was milled into the graveyard, and then Prized Amalgam, which will come into the battlefield if a Narcomoeba or a card, from the graveyard was then put onto the battlefield. And so the only land, I believe, that these decks ever play is Bazaar of Baghdad, which will allow you to, if you tap it, that will allow you to draw 2 cards and discard 3 cards. Now, this doesn't seem to do much, but the mechanic Dredge, which is what the deck is named after, allows you to, if you would draw a card, you may put the top, X number, depending on what the Dredge number is. So Dredge 5, Dredge 6, you put the top X number of cards from your library into your graveyard, where X is, the Dredge number. And then you get to return that Dredge card from your graveyard to your hand. And so the really powerful Dredge cards that have been printed are cards like Golgari Grave Troll, which has Dredge 6, as well as Stinkweed Imp, which has Dredge 5. And so the goal of this deck is to dump those cards into the graveyard, dredge them out, which will then put a bunch of other cards in, because if you, let's say you discard with Bazaar of Baghdad 2 Stinkweed Imps and a Golgari Grave Troll, you're able to dredge 16 cards and put 16 cards from your deck into your graveyard, presumably on turn 1. So this deck is lightning fast and can get tons of creatures onto the battlefield in no time at all.
Oh yeah, Travis, would you say that Dredge is the purest form of Magic?
Absolutely. That is how I feel in my heart and in my soul, and anyone else who agrees has a place in heaven. Especially made for you. Dredge is perfect.
Oh, for sure. So now that you guys know or have a general idea of some of the decks in Vintage and some of the cards and the power level of the Vintage format, you can kind of get an idea of how this might play out and how the power level might impact gameplay, Travis. Isn't that right?
Yeah, exactly. The biggest thing they have to remember for decks in Vintage and for strategies in Vintage in general is using the best cards ever made, so taking advantage of the best cards ever made in order to leverage a really fast win. All right, Jake, how fast are Vintage decks supposed to win?
So Vintage decks are generally supposed to win by turn 3. So as we talked about before the podcast, there's an unwritten rule of Magic formats. So for Standard, you're technically supposed to win by turn 6. Modern, you're supposed to win by turn 5. Legacy, you're supposed to win by turn 4. And Vintage, you're supposed to win by turn 3. And so that gives you an idea about how fast these games can actually go. And a match in Vintage can actually last about 5 to 10 minutes, Travis.
Right, yeah. So this sort of unwritten rule sort of says that your deck, if it was left to its own devices, it should have a win by, that specific turn. So in Vintage, if your opponent does nothing to disrupt your game plan, your deck should win by turn 3. Otherwise, it's just not fast enough for the format.
Exactly. You're not taking advantage of the best cards available to you in that format.
Exactly. So, that kind of goes to show how ridiculously powerful this format is, okay? Because I'm sure if anyone listening only plays Standard, the idea of winning by turn 3 is astronomical for any deck other than, some strange, insane, aggressive deck that I've never heard of before. But turn 3 is ridiculous. Now,
unless
Jake,
you just play an Oko in turn 3 and your opponent concedes, but you know how it goes.
Right. So, the way that these decks actually manage a turn 3 win, which could seem inconceivable to most people, is with the use of this fast mana. As we mentioned before, Black Lotuses, the Moxen, these cards allow you to play turn 5, as Jake said before, play turn 5 when it's only turn 2. In that way, you're winning by, quote-unquote, turn 6 when you have 6 mana, but that turn 6 is happening on turn 3.
That's exactly right. And so now that everyone has an idea about Vintage, the cards you'll see in the format, the decks you'll see in the format, and the overall power level of Vintage, we can get to how Vintage can really be transformed into a cube. Would you like to take that away, Travis?
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit on that just to sort of introduce the idea. So it can be really difficult to transform any kind of format, any kind of Magic format where the only limits on the decks available is the creativity of the public. So it can be really hard to transform something like that into a cube that has to have, that has a limit on the number of cards it can have and a limit on the number of archetypes that it can support. Right, so Jake and I came up with a couple, rules or strategies that can be used to really help you transform the Vintage format into a cube.
That's exactly right. And these are kind of unwritten rules, but they kind of show up in all of the Vintage cubes that Travis and I have seen, and even the Vintage cube on Magic Online, which is very popular.
Right, so the first of these strategies is using, very powerful cards to try to increase the power level of the cube. So what we mean by this is using the Power 9. Including cards that are busted like the Power 9 puts the Vintage cube at a power level far above any other kind of format cube. So a Legacy cube, a Standard cube, a Modern cube, they won't have these kinds of cards, and so automatically out of the gate, you've got a good, 9 cards, and then, if you want to add some other extremely powerful cards, maybe you have a good 20 cards that aren't played in any other, format of cube that just elevates your cube to a whole new power level.
Yep, so we're talking about, like Travis said, the Power 9. You're trying to take advantage of the most powerful cards ever printed in Magic's history. So as we talked earlier in this podcast about some of the best removal spells in white, such as Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile, you're taking advantage of the best removal spells ever printed in white and putting them in a Vintage cube to try and emulate the format. Same goes with Reanimate and cards like Tendrils of Agony and Brain Freeze for Storm.
Yep. And another strategy you can use is including cards that are not legal in any other format. Now, I know we sort of said that about the Power 9, about it not being legal in any other format, but what I mean by this point specifically are using really old cards that are not legal in any other format sets the cube in the Vintage time period. And so it doesn't have to be, if you're not trying to make a broken and busted cube, or maybe are trying to build vintage cubes on a budget, using really old cards is a really good way of setting that time period and getting the vintage feel because of those old cards. What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, these are some pretty good guidelines to follow because most of the cards that are banned or restricted in these newer formats, such as Standard, Pioneer, Historic, and Modern even, those cards are generally just too good for that format, and that just tells you that these cards are maybe good enough to be played in Legacy and maybe Vintage. If you're able to play those cards in Vintage, then their power level is just above a lot of the cards that Magic has printed over the years. And so those are some of the ways that you can transform the Vintage format into a Vintage cube. Now we want to try and make the cube feel like it's vintage.
So in order to get that, that vintage feel, to get that, that really, fast and competitive feel, you got to play that fast and competitive game. So you got to include those really busted and frankly just stupid strategies. Now we're talking, the Dredge strategies, Reanimate strategies, Storm, Stacks, all those things that we mentioned before. Playing those strategies, supporting those archetypes in the cube is super important if you're really trying to nail that vintage feel. I think as Jake was going to say, to feel vintage, you got to play vintage.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. And to do that, by the end of the draft, you should have a vintage-esque deck to play in your vintage cube matches. And if you don't have that, is it really a vintage cube, Travis?
Yeah, you might as well be playing Legacy or, I don't know, not vintage.
So to do this, be sure to have all of that fast mana in your vintage cube. We're talking the Moxen, we're talking Soul Ring, we're talking the Mana Crypts, Grim Monoliths, and the Lotuses of this world.
Exactly, yeah. And now we're going to get to in a little bit about, building a vintage cube on a budget, especially if you don't have a good $28,000 to drop on all the Power 9 and all these other cards that you're going to need. So just hang tight for that. But for those who are, diehard vintage cube bros and, want to create the most vintage feeling vintage cube, you're going to want that fast mana. Fast mana is a hallmark of the vintage format, and so if you want to get a cube that feels like vintage, then you're going to need that fast mana. It's just the name of the game. So as Jake was saying, exactly, Moxen, Mana Crypt. Even the Signets are really good, as well as cheap mana dorks like Birds of Paradise, or Gilded Goose now, the new one that was printed, as well as Llanowar Elves, Arbor Elves, those old things. The fastest mana in the game is the name of the game.
Oh yeah, and the Signets are actually really good at giving you colored mana, and that can be really important in your vintage cube decks.
Exactly, yeah. A lot of vintage cube decks are trying to span many colors. I've definitely played 5-color Leovold more than once in my entire life, and without Signets and without that, that good mana fixing provided by those cards you only see in vintage, original dual lands, that wouldn't be possible. So moving on to the next bit, if you want to feel like vintage, all right, I'll be real with you here, okay? We're gonna get in close and personal here. Like we kind of said before, okay? If you really, really want to feel like vintage, you gotta have the combos. Now I'm talking Kiki Jiki, Splinter Twin. I'm talking Sneak Attack. I'm talking Storm and any other infinite mana combo, okay? You want to put in Nyx Bloom Ancient and a Basalt Monolith and go crazy with colorless mana, cast an Ugin and just flip the table? I'm down for that, okay? That sounds wonderful, and that sounds like vintage.
It's the name of the game. You got to include those combo wombos in there, and if you don't, it's really not vintage, and you should just build yourself an actual vintage cube.
Right, and now for some people, they don't like combos. They don't like, people who can just sort of cheese out a win. They sort of want a grindy game, and I'm all for that. I absolutely, understand that, and that's a sort of building restriction, that people, frequently take on for their cubes. This part right here saying that about the combos, it doesn't have to be for you. You don't have to build these combos in, but vintage is a format of combos. It's a format of turn 3 combos where you try to kill your opponent by turn 3, and who can ever assemble their combo the fastest wins. And so to get that serious vintage feel, you're going to want to have those kinds of combos.
Yeah, and me personally, I love the slow, grindy games of Magic that can take an hour at 5 a.m. in the morning. Am I right, Travis?
Amen. But also on the flip side, sometimes it's really fun to just win. To just win because you have a combo and your opponent is playing aggro and you just mop the floor with their corpse.
Yeah, sometimes you just got to get some splurging in there and just win right away. Takes a minute.
Exactly. So now what I think we should do is move on to the colors and talk a little bit about sort of key cards that if you're thinking about building a vintage cube, you should think about including for each color and even multicolor, artifact, land, etc. to really, try to get a real vintage format. And now this, we'll put a link down in the description to the Magic the Gathering online vintage cube, the official vintage cube that they have. And that's where we pulled many of these cards from because they really did a really good job of just pinpointing the power of the format. And I think we would both absolutely recommend giving that a look.
Yeah. And if you guys are really serious about making a vintage cube, there's tons of info and tons of links and inspiration online. So I highly, highly encourage you guys to go and just try and find whatever you can out about vintage cube on the internet.
Yep. Finish this podcast episode first, and then, go click on the link below.
So we'll move on to the first color, which is green. And some of the hallmark cards in green for vintage cube are cards such as Terrastodon, Lotus Cobra, Birds of Paradise, Craterhoof Behemoth, and Tooth and Nail. So some of these cards, and actually a lot of these cards, do similar things. So we're going to kind of group these together. So Terrastodon, Craterhoof Behemoth, and Tooth and Nail are looking to do the same general thing, which is put big old creatures on the battlefield and do disgusting things. Whereas Birds of Paradise and Lotus Cobra are just trying to accelerate your play and give you that fast mana.
Yeah, exactly. So, as Jake was saying, with those first three, Craterhoof, Terrastodon, Tooth and Nail, those are those big, splashy finisher green spells that are signature to any vintage cube green deck. It's their win con, and they're really powerful and important win cons and really capture that kind of power. Then Lotus Cobra and Birds of Paradise, some of the best ramp out there. With fetch lands, in this format specifically, Lotus Cobra becomes really good because you have a fetch land, you get to crack it, and then you get to get another land out. So that counts as 2 lands for Lotus Cobra and will net you 2 mana. Lotus Cobra becomes a powerhouse of a card at that point.
Exactly, and that's not even counting the mana that you're going to get from tapping that land as well. So now moving on to blue, some of the signature spells in blue include Ancestral Recall, Jace the Mind Sculptor, Palinchron, Mana Drain, and High Tide. So same thing with green, and with every color in Magic, a lot of these cards are going to be grouped together. As before, these cards can be grouped together with common functionality. So for blue, High Tide and Palinchron can be grouped together in generating a lot of mana, whereas Mana Drain, Jace the Mind Sculptor, and Ancestral Recall act as controlling cards. Isn't that right, Travis?
Yeah, exactly. So with what you'll find a lot of times in Vintage Cube is that Palinchron and High Tide, these sorts of cards, they even combo with each other actually. If you have at least 6 islands out. So anyways, so these cards combo together really well and sort of do the same thing, which is sort of generate an infinite mana, which is something that is super powerful and Vintage Cubes try to do. Next, you've got the 3 controlling cards as Jake mentioned, and they're just extremely powerful control cards that again show the power of the vintage format and go a long way to sort of round out that controlling archetype.
Yep, and so with blue out of the way, we can move on to the more aggressive color of red. And red has cards such as Sneak Attack, Through the Breach, Goblin Guide, Kiki-Jiki, and Wheel of Fortune.
So now these cards can be grouped a little less cleanly than the other colors before, but we're looking at Sneak Attack and Through the Breach are almost the exact same effect, just one is a little bit more permanent, and those are sort of a combo to play and attack with huge threats long before you have any business casting them. A lot of time what happens is you sneak attack in one of the original printed Eldrazi with Annihilator that then makes your opponent sacrifice a bunch of permanents, and that puts you really ahead. Then with cards like Kiki-Jiki, we already mentioned him before, he's a really consistent combo piece that can just, again, win out of nowhere and win really quickly, which is, again, something that Vintage Cubes are trying to do. Next is Goblin Guide, which you put in here, not necessarily to highlight simply Goblin Guide, but he's sort of a placeholder here to talk about the aggressive side of red, where you want to put in the fastest and the most aggressive red cards for that aggro archetype, like Goblin Guide, like Monastery Swiftspear, Jackal Pup, Lightning Bolt, etc., etc. And then finally, Wheel of Fortune is just a really important combo piece for many, different kind of combo decks and decks that are trying to find, specific pieces, Storm decks as well. And so it's just an extremely powerful wheel effect and therefore has earned its spot in a vintage cube.
Yep, and now we can move on to white, which has cards such as Monastery Mentor, Mother of Runes, Land Tax, Armageddon, and Caracas. So Travis, what are these cards trying to do?
Cards like Armageddon, Land Tax, and Caracas show the more controlling and resource taxing side of white in those archetypes. Jake, with Monster Mentor and Mother of Runes, those can be, the more aggressive side or even the more combo-y side of white.
Yep, and those cards can act as a substitute win con for your deck. So Mother Runes can kind of push through some of your other creatures that might not always stick around on board, because Mother Runes allows you to tap itself to give a creature protection from a certain color, and protection is a really busted mechanic.
Right, yeah, and as you're saying, Monastery Mentor can be sort of its own win condition, especially because in a vintage cube, you'll notice that there are a lot of instant sorceries, and therefore many decks will play plenty of them to make Monastery Mentor a really viable win con. Now I think we can move on to black, Jake.
Yep, so black has cards such as Demonic Tutor, Reanimate, Yawgmoth's Will, Toxic Deluge, and Mind Twist. So black is kind of all over the place too with these groupings such as red is, but Demonic Tutor and Yawgmoth's Will can be compared a little bit because in a vintage cube, these cards act as almost 2 ofs of every card in your deck.
Right, yeah, so because what's really important about these cards is that because vintage cubes, or cubes in general, are usually singleton formats, having redundant copies of a card can be extremely helpful and provide some really needed consistency to a deck archetype or a deck strategy. So, as Jake was saying with Demonic Tutor and Yawgmoth's Will, these provide that second copy of a card and the extra redundancy to really make, combos and other strategies much better and much more consistent. Now, I'll talk quickly about Reanimate and Toxic Deluge. These cards are extremely different in their functionality, what the card's trying to do, but a certain theme that they have in common is paying life. And so you'll notice in Vintage, you really lean heavily on your life total as a resource because the most efficient and the most powerful copies of those cards allow you to pay life in exchange for mana, and because with the most efficient copies of certain effects, and so, for example, a card like Reanimate, which is just 1 black mana to return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, it's the best version of it ever printed because all you have to do, for that added efficiency is just pay a little bit of life for that converted mana cost. And so that's why, also with Toxic Deluge, it's a 3 mana spell that gives all creatures -X/-X when you cast it, where X is an amount of life that you're paying. This is extremely powerful because all the other board wipes throughout history have been, 4 mana or more. And so to get one for 3 mana with the slight cost of having to pay a bit of life is extremely efficient. And so that's what you'll see a lot in vintage cubes, are that you're paying life a lot more than you would in many other formats for the efficiency and the cheaper mana costs of certain cards and effects.
Yep, and so the only card remaining now is Mind Twist. And Mind Twist is X and a black. It will make your opponent discard X cards at random. And at random is very important. So with Mind Twist in a vintage format, you have a bunch of fast mana, so you might be able to cast Mind Twist on, say, turn 1 or 2 for 4, 5, or 6. And if you can make your opponent discard more than half their cards in their hand, you can kind of strip them of a lot of their resources and gain a huge advantage over them.
Exactly, yeah. Playing with Mind Twist and fast mana can almost put your opponent at a mulligan, which is a really powerful thing to do and really lowers their odds of winning. And so this card is a really good example of, the power of the vintage format, where something like this played in any other format where you're casting it on turn 5 and making them discard 3 cards may not actually be as powerful. You may not actually get them to discard, all that many cards, whereas in vintage, with the fast mana, which is, seen only in vintage, it can become something that takes away your opponent's resources before they've even had a chance to use them at all.
So now with the 5 colors out of the way, we can move on to multicolored cards, which are some of my favorite cards. And these cards include Mirari's Wake, Leovold, Dak Faden, Progenitus, and Fractured Identity.
And so with multicolored cards, I'm going to reiterate something that I said last episode about multicolored cards. In Vintage Cube, you want to make sure that your multicolored cards are signposts for the different archetypes, and so that people can see what each color combination is trying to do based on these multicolored cards. That is extremely important. I think we can move on to artifacts now.
Absolutely.
All right, so the artifact cards that are sort of key cards for Vintage are cards like Sensei's Divining Top, Lion's Eye Diamond, Winter Orb, Smokestack, and of course Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. Now, of course, Emrakul the Aeon's Torn put down the pitchforks and the torches. We know Emrakul is not an artifact, it's a colorless card, and therefore it's counted in the artifact or colorless slot.
Exactly, and like Travis said, some of these cards will be signposts of where you should take your deck during a draft, because if you have Smokestack, maybe you're going to be more of a stacks deck, and if you draft Emrakul, you might want to be more of a Reanimator or a Sneak Attack deck. So now moving on to the lands, which are very important in a Vintage Cube.
So the lands we have are the original dual lands like Underground Sea and Bayou. These are the most powerful lands, again, ever made, really, the most powerful dual lands ever made, because for no cost whatsoever, they just come into play and they can tap for one of the two colors. It's super powerful, and so because of that power and that consistency that they bring, without having to pay any sort of cost to have them come in, that's what makes them, really important for the Vintage Cube format. Next, we've got Mishra's Workshop, Library of Alexandria, Strip Mine, and Ancient Tomb.
So these 4 lands are utility lands, and they will allow you to do things that normal lands or basic lands wouldn't allow you to do, such as destroy other lands, draw extra cards, and get extra mana.
Right. Now I think that we've gone over the colors and the kind of cards that you want to include in these colors. I think we should talk about how to draft Vintage Cube in the first place. Target cards to draft, things like that, how to do that. And of course, we'll probably take a whole other episode to go really in depth on the drafting of a cube, but we're just going to give an overview so that from the building perspective, what people are going to be trying to draft, and therefore you know what you need to do to make those packs, really work.
So the number 1 cards you're going to want to draft in a pack that you'll see playing Vintage Cube are the fast mana cards. And I'm talking about the Moxen, I'm talking about Mana Crypt, and Lion's Eye Diamond.
Exactly. And now the second thing you're going to want to look for in the packs are the powerful combos, like Kiki Jiki, Pester Mites, Through the Breaches, Sneak Attacks, and other infinite mana combos.
And the next thing you want to look out for is insane value for little mana. And this might be a little bit easier in Vintage Cube because there's so many iconic cards, and they're going to be the most powerful cards ever printed. So cards such as Path to Exile, Reanimate, Swords of Plowshares, and Ancestral Recall. And these cards are examples of very powerful effects for very little mana investment.
Right, you are. And now the final thing you're going to look for is interaction. So once you've got the cards you need for your game plan, you want to start looking at ways to slow down your opponent's game plan. And so this is where interaction comes in. So the best cards like this are Thoughtseize, Mana Drain, Doomblade, other kinds of removal, and all the ways to interact and slow down or stop your opponent's game plan.
Yeah, because you just don't want them running wild all over you.
Exactly. So that brings us to the themes for Vintage Cube. This part is going to be kind of difficult to wrap one's head around. Hopefully we'll be able to explain it in a really clear way so you understand, because as we mentioned last episode, themes are kind of a wishy-washy sort of subject, but are important and are prevalent in Cube. So the thing about Vintage Cube is that it doesn't have to be the Magic Online Vintage Cube. It doesn't have to be the most busted version of Cube. There are many different themes that you can go for. So I think we'll just give a quick list of these themes and maybe 1 or 2 words of explanation for the themes that maybe aren't as clear to people. So the themes we've got are highly competitive and spiky, basically everything that we've been talking about up to this point, as well as reminiscing on old cards. So you may be someone who's been playing Magic since maybe the very beginning, and you want to build a cube that really captures the way Magic was, way back in the day, back in Alpha, Beta, Revised, Ice Age, really old things like that. I mean, I don't even know how old Ice Age is, but anyways, you can use those really old cards in a not extremely powerful, can be a very nostalgic theme.
Yeah, and so if you want to do that, maybe you only play with cards printed in those sets, and that will still bring that vintage feel. Maybe it will bring that old school vibe back around to you. Another way you can build your cube is you can just play cards that are banned or restricted cards. So we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier in the podcast. So you can build your cube off of all of the banned and restricted cards in all of the formats that have been banned or restricted throughout the history of Magic. And that can lead to a lot of powerful gameplay and some crazy decks as well.
Right, and so building off of that, you can remember when we were describing the vintage format, we said that the vintage format is made out of all cards Magic has ever printed, with few exceptions. Now, what you can do with this theme of playing with unplayable cards, is you can erase that little bit of with few exceptions off the end of that and play literally any card Magic has ever printed. So, as far as I'm aware, the vintage format is not legal to the unsets, and if you don't know what these are, give them a quick search on Google. It's going to be a lot to explain here, but they're like unglued, unsanctioned, etc., etc. So these sets just have super wacky cards, and so playing those, can add a certain kind of feel or flair to your cube and make it vintage, because again, those aren't playable anywhere at all, and so putting them in with a couple older, more powerful vintage cards can really be a cool place to build. As well as, certain conspiracy cards from the draft set Conspiracy, those are not allowed to be played in any Magic format at all. You can sort of, erase the rules around that and come up with something, and that's actually, a pretty cool design space. So that's what we've got for previously unplayable cards.
And so next up, you can build your cube off of highly competitive strategies, but maybe you don't want to spend all the money on the mocks. And Travis and I did this with our vintage cube. We tried to build a vintage cube on a budget because we knew we're not going to spend a lot of money on mocks just to play a vintage cube. But we still tried to take advantage of all that fast mana out there to try and emulate the power of Vintage Cube. Now, we might not win on turn 3 every time, but it is very possible.
Yeah, and we even had like a turn 1 win in that deck.
Oh, yeah. In that cube, that was great.
Right,
yeah.
So the thing with highly competitive on a budget is the idea that you're going to try to build cube themed around a very competitive and spiky draft format, but, you don't have all the money in the world, and so it's actually really interesting to try to make a really balanced format on a budget and a really cool design space. So that's another theme and another direction you can take the cube. Final theme for a vintage cube build around is emulating certain vintage metas. So let's say that you are, a high roller and you're really big into vintage and you've been following the vintage metas. You may want to build a cube themed around a certain meta that was, maybe the most balanced, the most fair, or the most fun. And so that is another theme or design space that you can go in for building your cube. I don't play a lot of vintage, so I can't give you a specific meta that was good, but I'd say anything without Phyrexian mana was probably a good vintage meta.
Anything with Manolos Dredge, huh?
Whatever meta had Manolos Dredge is the meta that I'd want to copy.
And so now with themes out of the way, we can talk about how you can go about updating your vintage cube, because this can be very hard to do, but we're going to give you a few tips on how you can do this.
Upgrades, people. Upgrades.
So when updating your vintage cube, you want to try and look out for cards that do the same thing as some of the cards in your vintage cube, but for less mana. So, for example, you might have Tormenting Voice in your vintage cube. You could replace that card with Faithless Looting because it is 1 less mana and it does essentially the same thing.
Right, exactly. And so you really want to look in the newer sets for any sort of replacement effect. So, for example, we have a Commander Cube, which is not like Vintage Cube at all. So we have a Commander Cube where we have Tormenting Voice in there. But the new card, Thrill of Possibility, just got printed, which is Tormenting Voice, but as an instant, which is just better. It's a better effect. And so having it as instant is superior to having it as a sorcery. And so we took out Tormenting Voice, we put in Thrill of Possibility, and that is an upgrade.
So you're going to want to look out for those cards that do the same thing, but either for less mana or, as Travis said, maybe it was a sorcery before and now it does the same effect for an instant. So you want to try and look out for those things, especially in those new sets, because that's where Travis and I got a lot of good ideas in cards to switch out in previously our Vintage Cube and now our Commander Cube.
Right. So the next thing you want to look out for are broken combo cards. I'm looking at you, Saheeli Rai, Felidar Garden. So if there are any new consistent combos or combo pieces that come out, that's what you kind of want to look for to put into your vintage cube, especially if you're building one of those really spiky and competitive cubes, or even those budget cubes that are competitive, because, the newer cards have a larger print run and therefore are usually cheaper. So examples of this are, perhaps cards that have the same effect as Pestermite for the Kiki Jiki combo. Example of this is Bounding Krasis, which was printed in Magic Origins, which, granted, it's not better than Pestermite, but it has the same effect where when it enters the battlefield, it can untap a permanent. Jake, can you think of any other examples of recent combos?
Oh, yeah, for sure. This isn't a combo itself, but is a essential combo piece, and it was in the most recent set, Theros Beyond Death. The card Underworld Breach is extremely powerful in older formats and cubes that have access to a bunch of these older cards that can really abuse it.
Right, yeah, it's basically a Yawgmoth's Will in red. Obviously, not exactly. Which actually, Jake, that reminds me of another combo piece recently printed in Theros Beyond Death, which is Helioid Sun Crowned, which very recently combos very well with Walking Ballista as well as Spike Feeder. And this combo was previously not a combo, or at least needed an extra card, but with Helioid, you now have a new 2-card combo, which is, the most powerful kind of combo.
And to the next point now, you're going to want to look out for those new archetype cards. So, for example, maybe you have the archetype like Wizards or something in your cube, and maybe they came out with a bunch of new pirates that are just like way better. So maybe you want like Direfleet Daredevil instead of Snapcaster, although Snapcaster's obviously better, but I'm just trying to give you guys a few examples of how you might go about that.
Right, and then also there may be, brand new archetypes that are just printed. Like we can't exactly tell you examples because we can't even fathom any new archetypes. But for example, Dredge, when it was printed, was a new archetype. Granted, it wasn't that huge at the time it was printed because it didn't have, all the pieces yet. But that in itself is its own brand new archetype. And so those sorts of things, you got to be on the lookout for them. They may happen once every, 100 sets, but that means that they will happen. And so keeping an eye out for cards like that, which will open a brand new archetype up, can be really, really important and a good way to keep your cube updated. Next, we've got really efficient cards. So sort of as we were saying, cards that do the same thing for less mana. This time, you're not really looking to replace effects or to find the same effect, but for less mana, but rather to find cards that are pretty powerful and really efficient. The card that comes to mind every time I think of this is Glorybringer. Glorybringer was a card from Amonkhet that was immediately put into Vintage Cube, as well as actually the Scarab God, which is from the next set, Hour of Devastation. I remember Amonkhet coming out and then watching Vintage Draft and seeing Glorybringer right in there. It was just automatically put in. It's an extremely efficient card and very powerful and does a lot. An effect like that in a card like that can make a really good upgrade. And the same thing with Scarab God, where it's a really efficient and powerful card and therefore can be an upgrade to other cards.
Yep, and while those cards are 5 mana, in older formats with that fast mana, you can really take advantage of those cards. Another card that got me thinking about that was Assassin's Trophy. When that card came out, everyone freaked out. It was like $45 for like a month, and then now it's like, what, $15 maybe?
I bought mine for like $6. All right, so now that wraps up, where you want to look for those upgrades. Now, I think we can move on to some examples of Vintage Cube. This is a really short list, but the best places we think to look in order to find some examples of Vintage Cubes if you want to emulate. So, Jake, take it away.
So, one of our favorite places to look at Vintage Cubes and examples of Vintage Cube is Magic Online. So, with Magic Online, they actually release an updated version of Vintage Cube every winter. And you can go ahead and look online or go on Magic Online and look at that list. And there's tons of videos and explanations on how to draft that.
Right, and we'll give a quick shout out and free advertising to Channel Fireball, which does a lot of Vintage Cube content. They have a lot of Vintage Cube drafts on their YouTube channel, so go and take a look at that if you're interested, and it will show you, all about that Magic Online Vintage Cube. Another place you can look is on deck sites, so sites that have a lot of deck lists on them.
Yeah, so there's Tapped Out, there's Cube Tutor, which is a very good site for vintage cubes and cubes in general,
as well as other websites such as MTG Goldfish or Scryfall, as well as, the official Wizards website. They all have lists for vintage cubes.
Yep, and we highly encourage you guys to go out there and look for examples of cubes to get a better feel for the vintage cube format or the cube format in general.
And so with that, we'll move on to our final topic, which is tips and tricks for folks looking to make Vintage Cube. So the first thing for Vintage Cube is that cards are an investment. So if you're playing cards like the Power 9, really powerful and really old lands, like the Dual Lands, Library of Alexandria, or other reserve list cards in general, know that these cards are an investment and that they can be an investment. Some people don't agree that Magic is an investment and that, it's something that you should put a lot of money into, sort of like a stock or something like that. And you don't necessarily have to believe that or agree with that at all, but these cards that you buy, these really expensive cards, I believe you should consider them an investment and therefore treat them as such, because again, these cards for the past 10 years and foreseeable future have been steadily gaining in price and have maintained at least their price, and for that reason you should consider them an investment. If you're spending $20,000 to buy the complete Power 9, you should consider that an investment and know that the odds are great that when the time comes to, let's say, resell those cards, put those cards back on the market, market, when you take apart your vintage cube, they will be worth what you paid for, perhaps more, obviously depending on, external factors. But it's also something as an investment you should keep an eye on. So if you spent $20,000 on the Power 9, you should keep an eye on those cards and their movement in the secondary market to make sure that if anything horrible happens, let's say the prices start to tank, that you don't lose that investment value. So as I was saying with the reserve list for the foreseeable future, that's not going to be taken down. And so those cards will never be printed again, and we'll continue to see a steady rise as demand for them grows. So again, if you're going to invest in these vintage cards, these really old cards, consider it an investment and treat it as such. The next point, which goes off of this, is to protect your cards so that they can be resold without losing too much value. So again, it's an investment. You're spending a lot of money on this, presumably. Even if you're making the most budget of vintage cubes, you're going to be spending quite a bit of money. So protect it. We like to protect our cubes in Ultra Pro sleeves, especially the Eclipse sleeves. Not sponsored, but as we said in the last episode, protection is really important. And if you're gonna, put all this time and energy into making the cube, what's the point if it's just gonna get destroyed by, your carelessness? So you might as well protect it. And especially with expensive cards, you want them to maintain their condition so that you can, if worst comes to worst, resell them and, not lose too much value.
Exactly. We can't stress this enough. Go out there and invest in good protection for your cube and just for your Magic cards in general, because most likely you're going to want to keep those cards in good shape. So moving on to the next point now, it is possible to make a vintage cube competitive and on a budget. Travis and I have done this ourselves, and it was extremely fun, and we still found that vintage feel to it. We've played many cubes, and we've played the Magic Online cube and actual cubes with Power 9 in them at our LGS, and we were able to use those cubes as examples to go off and make a budget but competitive cube.
Right, so with this, the things you're going to want to try to do are to get the cheapest versions of certain cards. So whether that means, you want to get the worst condition, like heavily played or damaged, because, those cards need a home too, whether you get heavily damaged cards, or you buy a card that has a similar effect, but for maybe a little bit of a greater cost, which then, makes that more expensive. So for us, for example, in a lot of our decks, in our Vintage Cube, we replace the idea of the original dual lands with shock lands because they're far cheaper, by, 10 to 20 times, and they're only a little bit worse.
Exactly that. And just because you're on a budget doesn't mean you can't have good mana in your cube. You can still put those signets in your cube, and the signets are fairly cheap. You can still have pretty good fixing in your cube and ramp in your cube without investing in those Moxen.
Right, and then a point you want to keep in mind, a really important point, we made this mistake when we made our Vintage Cube. It's first draft. If you're building on a budget and you're not buying the Moxen or the Black Lotus, do not include fast mana. Now, Jake mentioned the signets. I don't really count those in this category because you can get all 10 for rather cheaply and they spread rather evenly. What I'm talking about is don't include something like Soul Ring or Mana Vault, which are the cheapest of the fast mana, or Basalt Monolith in your cube because they will create an imbalance, especially with Soul Ring. Like, Soul Ring is only $3, guys, and it's an insanely powerful ramp spell. But if you just put a Soul Ring into your budget Vintage Cube, one person at the table is going to have an insane advantage over the rest of the table that really just you can't overcome.
That leads to unfun gameplay, and it can really shift the balance of your cube, and that's something you want to stray away from in every cube that you build.
Right. So in a normal Vintage Cube where you would have, let's say, 20 pieces of fast mana, if you just have one piece of fast mana, in your budget version, you can obviously see how, that fast mana love is going to be spread around far more shallow, as in only one person will get fast mana, whereas in normal Vintage Cube, people will have 2 or 3 sources of fast mana and it'll be much more balanced. So again, if you're building a budget Vintage Cube, stray away from the really cheap fast mana, like Mana Vault and Soul Ring specifically.
One last little trick that you can use in your Vintage Cube to help update the cube is looking in those Commander products that release yearly, because they'll have a lot of great cards that you might want to include in your Vintage Cube, such as Teferi's Protection and a card that was actually designed for the Legacy and Vintage format.
Right, and that's a really good point, Jake, that you brought up there. I had actually forgotten this, but Commander product is actually sort of a backdoor way of Wizards of the Coast to print cards for those older formats, Vintage and Legacy. It's a backdoor for them to print cards for those formats without them going through Modern and Standard first, especially because those formats are extremely powerful. And so what Wizards does sometimes, again, with the case of Treasure Nabber, is that they print cards for those formats and put them in the Commander products so that they sort of bypass those other two formats, standard and modern, and can go and benefit those sets. So really important, check the Commander product. You don't have to buy all the Commander product, just check the lists, see if there's anything that would be good to update your cube. So now that that is all on the stack, we will move to the resolution and hear a quote from the Rat God King himself, Lil Wayne.
And this quote of the day is brought to you by Young Money Entertainment Incorporated. Shout out Lil Wayne. Me and my dogs pull up in the Tesla. I'm going to bust down the Perpetual. Look at it too hard, it's going to bust your retina. All right, that's the end of the podcast. We're out.
Until next time, Miser Gang.
Peace.